Hello and welcome to Learn the Bible. We're on post 103. It's going to be from Exodus 19. It's called The First Trump. So we're now 3 months into the Exodus, and Israel is migrating their entire nation of over 1 million people across the wilderness as they head towards the Promised Land. So this nation was actually camped around a mountain called Sinai, in a land called Sinai, and we commonly refer to this mountain as Mount Sinai. Moses had been on this mountain before, way back when. If you think back to the beginning of Exodus, he was actually seeing a burning bush here, and that burning bush, of course, happened to be Jesus Christ, talking to him and telling him, I want you to go and free Israel. So one of the signs that he said that he showed Moses that he would be successful is that he would bring the nation back, and there they would worship God. And here that promise is fulfilled. They came back to the same mountain, and they're there to worship God. Now we're just going to pause for a second and think, do you ever wonder why God was relatively easy on the Israelites up to this point? We know that all throughout the rest of the Old Testament, when they sin, they do evil things, God punishes them. But up to this point, they had grumbled, they had complained, they had no faith in God when they came to the Red Sea during the plagues. As they crossed the Red Sea, when they got to the other side, they had a great celebration, and then shortly thereafter got thirsty and began to complain again. But God was always very lenient with them up to this point. Well, if you think back to Genesis, you're going to remember that God made a promise to a man named Abraham. And he told that man that through his seed of Isaac, he's going to bless the world. And he says, don't you worry about your offspring, because for 4 generations, for 400 years, they're going to go to a land that doesn't know them, that doesn't fear me. It's a land that's going to oppress them, enslave them, but I'm going to bring them safely out of that land. Now, when God makes this promise, there was a kind of a funny setting. He had actually told Abraham, hey, I want you to go and prepare a covenant. I'll give you my promise, which I had just mentioned, and then we'll talk about what you have to do, and then we'll both walk through this covenant or this agreement, and we'll each keep our end of the bargain. So Abraham went, he prepared the area, he split up some animals, sacrificed them, split them in half, and set them in this path that him and God were to walk through. But God then puts Abraham to sleep, and God goes through it alone. That means that that promise was an unconditional promise. That means that the entire world was going to be blessed through the seed of Abraham, regardless whether they honored or dishonored God. That meant that they would be brought out of Egypt regardless whether they honored or dishonored God. So up to this point, they were still an idol-worshiping nation. But to be true to Abraham, to the promise he made Abraham, God brought them out. So now that part is fulfilled. And now it's time to make a new covenant. The previous one was unconditional. This future one won't be. So Moses goes up to the mountain, and he wants to seek the will of God. He goes and he speaks to God, and God speaks and answers him. And then Moses goes and tells the people what God wants them to know. So God, of course, reminds Israel. He says, listen, look what I did to the Egyptians. Look how I saved you miraculously. I brought you on eagle's wings. And of course, when you go through the Bible, you're going to find out that eagles are usually symbolic of divinity. He then offers them a deal. He says, if you will follow my laws, if you will do the things that I tell you, I'm going to make you a peculiar people. You're going to be special out of the entire world, and you're going to be a kingdom of priests telling the world about the one true God. And the people of Israel, they were told those words, and they're like, well, that doesn't sound so bad. We can honor and live for God. He's obviously very powerful, and we will serve him. So they're now waiting for God's side of the agreement, so what their requirements would be from God, so that he would honor this agreement where he would make them a very special people, chosen for him. So God's actually pleased to hear their words, and he's pleased that they're going to agree to this conditional covenant. But he also knows that they will never be able to keep their side of the agreement. The book of the law, all the laws of the Old Testament, they are literally showing you how perfect God is. And God knows that humans can't be perfect because they're not him, they're not God. So before he finishes and closes off the chapter where we read the 10 Commandments, it ends with them having to build an altar. An altar is used for sacrifice. Sacrifice is used for sin, and sin is breaking the law. So he knew they would never be able to keep their end of the bargain, so he already provided them a way out through shedding of blood of an innocent sacrifice. And we'll get more on that later. So Moses goes back to God with the response of Israel, and God tells Moses that in order to receive the law, the people need to purify themselves. They have to spend 3 days, and they need to be perfect during those 3 days. No sin, no sexual relationships with their wives, and they would then approach, after washing their clothes and washing themselves, to the mountain where they could receive the law of God. And on the 3rd day, he made it clear he would present himself in a miraculous and undeniable way so that all Israel would know that this was definitely the words of God, not the words of Moses. So despite the people cleaning themselves and washing their clothes, and despite the fact that God was coming to approach them, they were not allowed to approach where God was. They couldn't get onto the mountain where God was going to meet with Moses. No matter how clean they seemed, it wasn't clean enough to allow them in the direct presence of God. They had to set a barrier around the mountain to make sure that no animals and no people approached. And if they approached, they would receive the death penalty. They'd be stoned to death. Well, on the 3rd day, this trumpet's going to blow. And all the people could approach but not come onto the mountain. And they had to remain pure until after all this would happen. So you got to ask yourself, why did they wait for the 3rd day? What was so special about waiting until the 3rd day? Why did the people have to remain pure and righteous for 3 days? They cleaned themselves, they did everything they were supposed to, but they still weren't allowed on the mountain. So even though they had separated themselves and done everything according to God's rules, they still couldn't approach God. If you read throughout the Bible, you're going to find that 3 is a symbol of completeness. The human is body, soul, and spirit. God is a Trinity. All throughout the Bible, you're going to find 3 being the complete picture. Well, for 3 days, remember Jesus, he died for 3 days, and he was resurrected to pay for the sin of the world. The 3 days proved he was definitely dead, and yet his body would not yet have decayed, just like the Bible said. Well, 3 days of purity here would seem like enough to say, look, we've done good deeds for 3 days. Surely that wipes away our previous bad deeds. But it makes it pretty clear that no matter how many good deeds they did, no matter how long they remained pure, they would never be good enough to approach God. The only one allowed to approach God was Moses and the priest, Aaron. So someone had to intercede with God for the people. And so no matter how perfect or how right they lived, they would never be good enough to approach without Jesus Christ. So 3 days, if some people say, well, they were good for that long. Well, 3 days or 300 years does not make up for a single sin you've committed. Whenever someone goes and is caught and taken to the judge, people don't say, well, how long have you been crime-free? If you robbed a bank 10 years ago and they catch you, you'll be tried for that robbery, not for the banks you didn't rob for the last 9 years. You'll be charged for the sin. Good deeds don't make up for bad deeds. They still need paid for. So no matter how long they were pure, they couldn't approach Christ. Yet, once they had been purified or sanctified, like a priest was, by the blood of a sacrifice, they then were able to approach Jesus. And we'll find out later in the rules of the temple how the high priest would go in 1 day a year to make sacrifice for the people of Israel, and then they couldn't even think an evil thought. So the point is, someone of perfection has to go to God on your behalf in order for you to approach the throne. So the priest was allowed to go see God, but none of the people could approach. So everything happened according to the instructions, and on the 3rd day finally arrived, and there were lightnings and thunders and just clouds overcoming they weren't coming from the sky though, they were actually coming from the mountain. There was something going on there. And there was this loud trumpet blast that just kept getting louder and louder and louder. The people became terrified. They were literally shaking in their boots. Well, Moses, as he was instructed, he approached the mountain to meet with God. And the people, they remained at the base of it. They didn't come on the mountain just like they weren't supposed to. So they did everything according to the rules God had let out. Well, the entire mountain smoked like a furnace and shook. I doubt they wanted to get on the mountain. And the trumpet blast kept getting louder and louder until Moses spoke. And then the trumpet stopped and God answered in an audible voice. The trumpet seems to be the incomprehensible voice of God, but it was changed in order to answer Moses. And by the way, this is not the last time that the world will hear the voice of God as a trumpet. Here, God is selecting a people from the earth to belong to him. The next time, God will be removing a special people from the earth. And you're going to find this event is called the rapture. And for the second time in human history, that voice also sounds like a mighty trumpet. It's actually called the last trump. So God came to the top of the mountain and he calls to Moses. And he tells Moses to go back down and warn the people not to come on this mountain or they will die. Moses tries to explain, well, he's already warned them. God's like, no, you don't understand how rebellious these people are. Get down there and make sure they don't come up. And he says, go get Aaron and bring him with you. God is about to reveal to Moses his law. And his law we commonly call the 10 Commandments, but honestly there are many, many other commandments that are not necessarily included here. So we're going to get into that next time. Thank you, God bless you, and thanks for joining us on Learn the Bible.